Hi guys, and welcome to the guide. In this episode we're talking about the Vought F4U Corsair, a favorite aircraft among the Marine pilots in World War II, and known for its very distinct bent wing design, which you can get a good look at right there. It's known officially as the inverted gull wing design, and it's one of the rare few planes that I'm aware of that has ever used it. I think there might have been like one or two others. I think there was one more in World War II, but nothing like that used it as distinct as the Corsair did. The Corsair became a favorite in the hands of Marine Corps pilots, such as the infamous Black Sheep Squadron, which would later get a television series made after him, and I think they got a movie made after him. I think it was in the 60s or 70s. It's an old TV show, but it was very risque for its time, if I remember right. But it pretty much documented the exploits with a lot of dramatization of the Black Sheep Squadron, a Marine fighter group that flew the Corsair during World War II, led by Major Gregory Pappy Boington, who was an extreme drinker and also an extremely skilled fighter pilot all in one. The Corsair would go on to earn a kill-to-death ratio of 11 to 1 in the Pacific War during World War II, which is an extremely good kill-to-death ratio by any measure for any airplane throughout history. And that's partially to thank to the Wildcat, the aircraft that came before the Corsair and held the burden of the Navy's and the Marine Corps' frontline fighter for the first half of World War II in the Pacific. The Wildcat was the aircraft largely responsible for breaking the Japanese back. It was the aircraft that the Navy and the Marine Corps used during the Battle of Midway, where the US finally was able to take the initiative away from the Japanese. And it doesn't exactly get the credit that it deserves because it wasn't an outstanding performing aircraft. It could hold its own, but it didn't have any defining beneficial characteristics that made it better than the enemy Japanese era. The Corsair, on the other hand, did. Like, the Corsair was an amazing flying aircraft, and all around was a better airplane than anything the Japanese could throw at it. The Corsair could dogfight with the Japanese, while the Wildcat had to use tactics and strategies to keep up with the Japanese. But by the time the Corsair came into service in late 1942, early 1943, the Wildcat and its pilots had already been used to destroy a good portion of the Japanese Air Force services in like the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Coral Sea, and the Japanese were not as good as replacing pilots as the United States was. So when the Corsair did come into service, the Japanese had already lost a good number of their skilled and highly trained pilots to the Wildcats. So the Corsair overall had an easier time when it was introduced compared to the Wildcat. And it also had a lot more seasoned and veteran pilots flying it whenever it was introduced, unlike the Wildcat, because when the Wildcat started the war, pretty much all the American pilots were green and didn't know what they were doing, while when the Corsair was introduced in late 1942, early 1943, there was a whole bunch of seasoned veteran pilots ready to go who already knew what they were doing, who just had to jump into the cockpit and figure out how to fly the Corsair rather than how to fly the Wildcat. So overall, the Corsair had a much easier introduction into the war than the Wildcat did. The Wildcat had to fight an uphill battle at the beginning of the war, while whenever the Corsair was introduced, the initiative had already been taken away from the Japanese and the initiative was firmly in the Americans' hands. So it just made the introduction of the Corsair that much easier in comparison to the Wildcat. Like, the Wildcat deserves a lot more credit than it gets in its role in World War II. Alright, so with that in mind, let's get to the specs. The specs for the Corsair F4U-1, which was the most produced version of the Corsair during World War II. It had a top speed of 424 miles per hour at about 20,000 feet. It could climb up to 34,000 feet, so it had a ceiling of 34,000 feet. That's about as high as it could go. It had a gigantic Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine in it, which was an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced 2,250 horsepower, which is a whole bunch of horsepower. I mean, I would love to see a sports car that had 2,000 horsepower in it. And we were doing this in World War II, which is amazing. And plus, it was a radial engine, which only added to the reliability of the Corsair, because radial engines are super reliable engines. You can shoot cylinders out of radial engines and they'll keep chugging along. Compared to the more inline liquid-cooled engines that were more popular in the European theater, which were a bit more finicky and they could not take damage nearly as well as a radial engine. So radial engines are like super reliable engines of World War II. It had a wingspan of 41 feet and a length of 33 feet. It was armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wings, or depending on the model, some of them that were more ground target focused had 4 20mm machine guns, 2 in each wing. And each one still had enough room for about 2,000 pounds of bombs or rockets, depending on the mission and what they wanted to do for that particular mission. The Corsair proved itself to be an amazing fighter bomber during World War II. It was rugged enough that it could go down and it could take small arms fire from ground troops as it was doing bombing runs or rocket runs or whatever, but it was also nimble enough that it could tango and dogfight with the best the Japanese could throw at it. So it proved to be a very versatile airplane and a favorite among the Marines of World War II. It would even live on into the Korean War, becoming one of the rare few piston-driven World War II planes to actually fight in the Korean War. Originally, it was designed as a carrier-based fighter, but because of its extremely long nose, it had a really long nose on it because the cockpit was pushed back early in the design phase to make room for an extra gas tank right in front of the cockpit. So that made the nose really long, and it made landing on aircraft carriers difficult for the pilots. So when it was first introduced, the Navy realized this and realized that they didn't really want it on aircraft carriers. So they ended up handing it off to the Marines, which the Marines were super excited for it because it was an amazing plane in the air. It's just hard to land on an aircraft carrier. So the Marines didn't really give a crap because they operated off of land bases on islands anyways, captured islands, so it didn't matter to them. And eventually the Corsair did make it back onto aircraft carriers, but that was after the British, who got about 2,000 of them, figured out how to land them properly on aircraft carriers. And then once the British figured it out, then the US Navy got on board, and then towards the end of World War II, the Corsair finally made it onto aircraft carriers in operational service. But throughout the war, the Corsair proved itself to be like a proper badass plane. It could fight with the best the Japanese could throw at it, and it could support ground troop operations in like rocket runs and bombing runs. And that makes the Corsair an extremely awesome airplane. Thanks for watching.